All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And as people come in, I'll keep letting them in. But without further ado, I just want to make sure that we jump right into things because I'm really excited to hear today's talk as well. So please welcome Dr. Iroro Tanshi, who is joining us. Are you traveling right now or are you in Washington?
I am in Washington,
You're in
Seattle.
Washington State. Okay, so joining us from Washington State. And just some brief announcements before we get started. We are going to be taking a break next month. So there is not going to be a My Field for Dummies in July. So you can expect one in August. So stay tuned for the announcement on who our speaker is going to be in August. Otherwise, I want to go ahead and pass it off to our speaker today, Dr. Tanji, who's going to be talking to us about bat foraging guilds. So without further ado, please take it away.
Thanks, Dana. Well, thanks everyone for showing up to this. I'm very excited to be talking to you today about foraging guilds because it's something that has basically um, been dotted across my entire career studying bats from about 16, 17 years ago. Um, but what I will try to do is to interweave the idea of foraging guilds and focusing on foraging guilds or paying attention to foraging guilds, um, interweave that with my questions, my research questions, and some of the results that I get, but also other people's research to really bring home this idea that we do need to really pay attention to foraging guilds, not just as an add-on, but as a serious integral part of the ecology of bats. Um, in many ways, it's sort of a letter to my younger self, starting off my MSc and not knowing what I was dealing with bats. And until I came across a few papers that I will talk about, did I start to get the sense of what was going on with foraging ecology, and bats. Without further ado, let's see. There we go. All right. So I typically work at the intersection of foraging ecology, biogeography, and global change ecology. And so my research really merges these themes across space, especially across the southern Nigerian forests, because it's got the part of the Congo, Guinean forests biome, as it were, but also primarily because I am really curious about some of the mechanistic processes that drive patterns that we see across space and time. And so I get to do both functional ecology and biogeography at the same time. Now, I'm speaking to a bat audience, so I'm not going to go into why I study bats. But of course, we all know they're cool, so nothing more to be said there. Like I said, the reason I really wanted to talk about foraging ecology um, guilds was because I found that throughout my 16-year career, it has come up either when you're designing your questions or when you're doing field surveys, or of course it will it affects even when you're not designing for foraging ecology. If you're just doing what I do with functional ecology or biogeography, you do need to think about the results and how you interpret those results in the context of how these bat foraging guilds. And of course, it then affects conservation. Some of you may know that I do conservation work uh, for African bats, primarily in the Gulf of Guinea forests, focused on Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea, and Cameroon. But it's really an important part of this sort of this concept of bat foraging guilds that we must think about it the whole way, everywhere from conceptualization to indeed conservation. Now, this is kind of where it all begins with Fott et al. I had seen this paper. This is a seminal paper, and if you're an ecology student and you haven't read this paper, I don't know what you're waiting for, but go find it. It's a really cool paper, and I read it as a master's student, but didn't really, sort of translate it fully, until I read some of the more bat specific papers. But the whole idea is with animal communities, at least, and I guess, even plants too. What you're looking at is if you sort of explore the three dimensions, so to speak, of how species occur in space and time, you're really looking at phylogeny, resources, and geography. Where does it occur? What type of food does it eat? And what are the phylogenetic relationships in there? And you can start to nail down, relationships and the overlaps between these dimensions to see whether you're dealing with a community or an assemblage or ensembles, as it were, as well as guilds. And so that's sort of the background to all of this. But one of my favorite papers in bioecology is this paper by Schnitzler and Kalko, with a colorful version by Jacobs and Bastion, and it actually has mostly African bats on there. But this whole idea that bat foraging guilds haven't been split off by Denzinga, I believe, but really it's coming not just from a place of, oh, this is where we trap the bats, but it's really about the ecology, the echolocation patterns and signals, so to speak, and they how bats are adapted for type of foraging space versus the other, as well as what type of foraging mode. And I'm not going to get into all of this. I'm just saying if you're a student of ecology or interested in ecology, find these papers and read them like a gazillion times, and then you will really start to get the sense. But again, this is again the background to the work that I do. But this is where my work really starts is I started working 2010 or so with bats and trying to understand uh, bat diversity, so to speak. And one of the first things that came up was this idea of of exploring African bat diversity relative to other tropical regions. And in my case, when I started doing my PhD 4 years later, um, I came upon this. I didn't come upon it. I did, from the literature, saw that there was this big disparity between what was predicted for bats in Southeast Asia. This is Southeast Asia. This is, let's see, it's Malaysia somewhere here. There you go. And Indonesia, Singapore. But you compare that to bats in Nigeria, for example, southern Nigeria, where the equator, this is the equator, right? The distance from the equator is not that huge, so it's all equatorial, equatorial paleotropics, as it were. It's you really go down to Finley's paper, and there was this prediction that in Nigeria you would expect to find 40 species relative to double the number in the in Southeast Asia, and even you get up to say like 100 that's predicted for um, sites in Malaysia. And it's one thing to predict, um, how things might be different, say, between the paleotropics and the neotropics, but it's quite another to predict this sort of patterns when you're looking at the same global species pool, because all of the paleotropics sort of share species. They're from the same global species pool. So that level of difference was quite striking to me. And so I kind of started seeing the point in some of the older papers in African bat diversity and ecology, stressing that, ooh, maybe we're not seeing the full picture here. And that for me was real interesting. All right, so those three places, I highlight them because that's where again got additional data to be able to explore this type of question about whether our tropical bats are depopulate as suggested in the literature. And, it was really some of the foundational questions in that regard came from Finley, who at the time was doing what other museum directors who had access to long-term data sets and large archival data were asking about diversity in hyperdiverse groups, like say birds in this case, comparing them with multiple sites across the tropics. And based off of Finley's couple of days spent in Cameroon trapping bats, and maybe trapped maybe 10 individuals in one night or so. It was quite appalling if you were a bat scientist working and you're working at night in true difficulty, as we all know, and you're trapping just 10 individuals. I think he was quite displeased with that. And so that makes sense that at that time, this is the sort of questions you would ask: are African bats, um, are there bats in Africa to begin with, but are they rare? That was more like the question. And so I wanted to set that in the time that Finley was asking this question. And it was really interesting that some of the things he came up with, because he then concluded that Afrotropical bats are quite depopulate, excuse me, and that depopulate condition was because of fruit bats diversity, which, as we now know, that is not the case. But again, he was working with the data that he had at the time. So again, if we're talking about bat foraging guilds, and the reason I did not break down the bat foraging guilds beyond, the foraging spaces is, if you're interested, you do need to know beyond just the identities of the bats. You need to know the ecology. So I didn't go into it. You really should find those papers and read them and make notes and decide for yourself. But essentially, with the thing you're really interested in with field surveys, and again, you do need to know all of these details prior to going out to the field. But of course, by the time you start to plan your field surveys, it should impact the type of questions you're asking should impact where you survey. So not just the geography, but what part of that geography. So what part of that space, the physical space. So you're at a site, where should you place your net or your trap or whatever? Are you focusing on open space bats versus edge space or understory bats? But also, how are you going to trap them? And what will you use really to trap them? And the how is a combination of, are you doing bats in forest versus other spaces, but also within forest, how do you set up that trap? How do you set up that net? And what would you use? Would you do acoustic techniques or trapping? Within trapping, what types of um, traps are most ideal? So these are questions that you must consider depending on if you're interested in, you know, all bats at a site, or if you're targeting a specific group, which is what I did for my PhD. I did target a group. And again, just trying to say, these are some of the key literature to also look at if you're looking at trapping bats, especially in the tropics, and you're really wanting to hone in on what's ideal, what method is ideal for what. There are lots of method things out there, but this is a really good resource, and you should definitely try to check it out. Right. So I was trying to say, would you use what type of trapping methods would you use, for example? And if you're interested in open space bats, you're okay if there is a useful library, a good enough library to rely, only on echolocation. But of course, depending on the type of questions you're asking, you may very well do it regardless, assuming there are no libraries, but you're just interested in maybe say a presence, abundance, and all that. I'm not going to go into all of these methods business, but the whole idea being that of this slide being that different bat guilds are amenable or are detectable, that's the word, to better detected by acoustic techniques than others. So if you're in the paleotropics, um, again, I would keep referring to the paleotropics because that's where I have the most experience. In fact, I've only trapped bats once in the neotropics, and it was just a fun night out with some friends. But the point here being that if you're in the paleotropics, you really I don't want to say you're wasting your time if you're in the forest understory using acoustic techniques, but it's kind of what it is, because in the forest understory, the paleotropics, the bats are using at least it's dominated by groups that use very high frequency, and high frequency calls don't travel really far. So if your bat's not flying very close and in front of you, you're really wasting your time. I have done um, uh, an intensive survey effort of trying to record bats in the forest on the survey as a test, even though we sort of suspected it might be a waste of time. For 45 straight days, just trapping bats, recording bats along mountains and two mountains, and didn't get a lot of forest on the story bats. So I can tell you from my personal experience, this is very true. This is not just hearsay. So if you're planning work in Africa or in Southeast Asia, don't plan to rely on acoustic surveys if you're going to target forest understory beds. But if that's all you have and you really want to go ahead and ask questions, that's fine. But be sure to recognize the limitations of this methodology for forest understory beds. Now, one of the biggest concerns that then came up with some of the work that I was talking about Findlay is the type of data he had available. And if you're in the paleotropics, you're really dealing with bats that are very adept at picking up, at avoiding, not just picking up, at maneuvering and avoiding obstacles. So if you're using a mist net in the forest understory in the paleotropics, it's sort of it's almost a waste of time because the detection of mist nets is much better than things like a hop trap. And it's not just a matter of detection. Hop traps are unique in the sense that the way they're set up, the strings between them and the spaces between the strings sort of trick the bats to think they can avoid the strings. And by so doing, when they flip, so the bat is going zzz along that trail, by the time they're really close to the net, the trap, the strings confuse them to think they can flip between the strings and fly it through. But of course, there are multiple strings, and uh, before they know it, they crash in and slide into that cool bag, and then you're a happy bat researcher, you go pick it up. But essentially, these are the two main trapping techniques for bats. There are other things, other kinds of trapping techniques uh, that I actually summarize in the paper that I haven't cited here, but you can go find it. Essentially, you really want to think about what you're interested in. So for my PhD, I was interested in forest understory bats specifically because that's where at least we're starting to, we that's where I felt confident that I could ask questions about I could, that was a group I felt confident I could focus on what the kind of questions I wanted to ask. All right, so that said, this is a paper I was talking about. What we do know now is that the paleotropics, hop traps have significantly changed our understanding of the bat diversity in the regions, in both paleotropical regions. And so by paleotropics, I keep talking about paleotropics, but we're talking Africa and Southeast Asia for those who don't know. And what we know is that by the time hop traps were introduced in Southeast Asia, at least, bat diversity known from the region basically skyrocketed, whereas mistnet captures, slowly increase when I'm talking about new species descriptions, okay? So with hop traps, you're really picking up all of those hidden diversity that wasn't known, so to speak, from the region. And so hop traps have become the go-to thing if you're really working in paleotropical forests. And and in Finley's case, some of the data, see when Finley's paper was published in 1995, hop traps were already being used in the paleotropics in the late 80s. So Francis published his work 1989. That was the first hop trap um, paper from the paleotropics. So Finley had data um, from Southeast Asia that had used trap data and collected a good number of forest understory bats. And so if you're hopping over to Africa where there hadn't been a concerted hop trap trapping effort, I think there was one study in 1970s in somewhere in Liberia or South Africa that used hop traps, but it wasn't like a serious, heavy duty survey like this. In any case, the data were different, is what I'm trying to say. And that made people start to really question this huge disparity between Africa and excuse me, and Southeast Asia. and of course recall this graph. So I'm going to just skip along. But for my PhD study, I wanted to study bats along the elevational gradients, and I picked the forest understory group because as soon as you find use the right trapping technique, you can immediately start to sample that space relatively well and with confidence. If you're on a mountain and you're trying to sample open space bats, well, there are many things that you have to contend with. There's always wind that impacts how many bats you're getting and whether or not you're even able to get lots of bats. But by the time you're focusing on forest understory bats and you're using the right trapping techniques, you asymptote a bit quicker um, with with that survey technique. So I did a bunch of surveys, both trapping and acoustics, and did a bunch of ecological data collection as well, everything from insect trapping to vegetation surveys, as well as collecting functional traits, ecomorphological traits, all of those built around or focused on forest understory bats. So I did do a little bit of trapping for the open space just to sort of give a sense of what was generally in the community, but that was not my focus. And so all of my work was forest understory bats. And so I used a lot of hop traps in the forest understory. We're talking 10 hop traps every night, that just, set up along his transects at each elevational band as you go up the mountain. And that's all I'm going to say about the work that I did. But essentially, the results need to then be interpreted in that context of what foraging guild I focused on. And so in my case, as I was planning my PhD questions, this paper came out in 2015, suggesting that in the Afrotropics in Nigeria, and especially in southeastern Nigeria, we're sitting in Africa's largest block of I want to say contiguous high diversity areas. So the hyper diverse, largest area of hyper diversity of bats, and sort of connected it with mountains. And so that was cool for my decision to go with mountains as part of my questions. But what that study basically showed was that if you're here in southeastern Nigeria, where I was in my field work, you're really looking at about 75 plus species. So both a combination of all the uh, um, uh, bat foraging guilds, so across all bat foraging guilds, you're looking at a high diversity of 75 bat species, which is quite comparable with what was being predicted, at least based off of Findley's work in 1995. And so, so I felt quite confident that, going into this work, there'll be some exciting finds. So basically what was hidden that hadn't been seen from the region, and I was really excited for that. So that question about whether Afrotropical bats were depopulate obviously then became one of the questions that I addressed. And again, like I said, I was looking at all these sites in Southeast Asia, comparing sites from Malaysia, data from Malaysia, Sulawesi, and Sumatra, excuse me, Sulawesi and Sumatra. I'm mixing them up. So Sumatra is this way, Sulawesi is this way. There we go. I need to travel the region. Sorry, I haven't traveled there once. Anyway, so those were sites that I got data from, and I was able to compare with my sites in Nigeria. But I focused because I was doing elevational gradients. I didn't use all of the elevational gradient data because all of these other sites in Southeast Asia were lowland sites, and so I focused only on lowland sites in my from my African sites. All right, so I'm going to skip along. And what did I find? I was basically showing that besides this heavily sampled, heavily sampled sites in Malaysia, and this was a work that Tiga did where she basically combed the forest, if you see what I mean. It's a 3 by 3. She had sites that were her sample design moved traps every 20 meters within the 3 by 3 kilometer square grid. That is the most intensive sort of bat protocol, survey protocol that anyone's ever um, accomplished till date, as far as I know, um, in tropical bat ecology. Every 20 meters was sampled. And that, besides that site, all of the other sites, at least in the region, were overlapping with sites in Africa, my sites in Africa, suggesting that the diversity isn't that huge. And so that is to say, species richness as you accumulate your number of individuals. So that question of whether bats are rare in Africa, that the title of that Findlay's paper doesn't necessarily fit this because and you'll see what I mean in a second. And what I then did was beyond the alpha diversity, I also looked at regional diversity and so compared ecoregion level regional diversity, so beta diversity, and try to unpack the drivers of beta diversity. And what it's showing is that there isn't really a huge difference in turnover because there are two components, and I'm not going to go into that, of beta diversity. It's turnover and nestedness, and I was showing that um, there's no difference between the Lower Guinean forest, so southern Nigeria, and the Malay Peninsula in terms of turnover, but there's a huge difference, significant difference in nestedness. But overall, the beta diversity stayed the same. So there are components that are different between these places. That's the same plot here on the left again, but I want to draw your attention to this right plot, and let's sort of forget all the plant visiting bats from both regions and really focus on the other insectivorous guilds, which is sort of the focus of this talk, right? The open edge and narrow space bats. And what I was showing was that in the Lower Guinean forests, um, turnover was much higher than nestedness across the different foraging guilds. But with the Malay Peninsula, turnover was really highest. Sorry, not turnover, but nestedness um, was higher than turnover, significantly so, only in the narrow and open space bats, but especially in the narrow space bats. So that really stresses this idea that forest understory bats, if you just follow the logic, okay, if nestedness is high, it means most sites are similar than different. So, and that forest understory bats are quite um, a hyper-diverse group, so to speak, in the Malay Peninsula. And so that difference between forest understory bats, between forest bat assemblages or communities in Africa versus those in Southeast Asia is really driven, at least by nestedness in the Malay Peninsula, but specifically because there's a lot of diversity of forest understory bats in the region. And I'm not going to explore that further, but that's sort of the whole idea. And I graphed this, in the paper that I published exploring this, but to really show that tropical bats are not depopulated if you look at different dimensions of diversity in the region. So, alpha diversity, versus beta diversity, but also I explore the other dimensions like functional and phylogenetic, which I won't discuss here. But this whole idea that you're dealing with different groups, and so you must pay attention to your foraging groups to explain some of the patterns that you're seeing. But one of the other cool outcomes of my survey was because I was using such an intensive forest understory sampling protocol. I recovered 10 new country species, 8 of which were exclusively in hop traps. I mean, imagine if I wasn't using hop traps, that exclusivity of trapping 8, records will just be gone. It will be like poof, and you're there using mist nets every night after night, and you're not trapping, like, making exciting trap captures. It really does stress the point that uh, there's hidden diversity primarily because, at least in terms of sampling techniques because of the type of straps that you use. And that's an important point to make. So I'm going to just skip along with the trapping new. One of the new country records was an endangered species and has now become this big part of our program in Nigeria and the Gulf of Guinea forests. Region. So now I'm just going to skip to part of the work that I've done for my postdoc that is also exploring, diet. And I'm not going to go into the details of what I do with diet, but essentially, if you're looking at bat community, you can really slide along, um, a gradient of prey properties. So either whether they're soft versus hard prey or even prey size. And so you're really sort of going from really soft things that may be, big or small to really tough things like beetles that may be, again, big or small. And we know that there's a relationship between how much a bat can handle just from, general predator-prey relationship, but also specific to bats. Of course, the small guys here will only be able to handle insects up to a certain size relative to, the giants in the system. And we know that bite force does impact, bite force is impacted by how much, by the size of the bat and especially in bats, its head length is a really important measure. And so uh, my predictions are usually around, again, I split things by foraging space, the bats within different groups, and I show that, explore the idea that, of course, in these different foraging spaces, you've got insects of different sizes and different prey properties, so toughness and how that differs. It's just every foraging space should have some measure of all of these things in there. So, but what do the bats in these foraging these foraging spaces? How are they adapted or not, as it were, to foraging for different groups of insects or different insects of different properties in these spaces. And you can start to make predictions based off of what we understand of the size of the bats. And where I really get down to exploring whether, the size and bite force relationship that we know, whether you can really see that pattern in each of the foraging groups. And that's sort of where some of my hypotheses line up to explore the different bats are foraging in different foraging spaces and what sort of relationship you expect to find. And you can make various predictions, and of those predictions you then test. And what I then did for my postdoc was, instead of just focusing on the two sites that I had done for my PhD, I went back to those sites, but also trapped along entire southern Nigeria, including multiple additional sites and the Gulf of Guinea forests. All very exciting times in the field that I miss these days. But essentially collected a good chunk of data, everything from poop and then scores as well. And this is what you see is that with body mass. So again, remember size, body mass on the x-axis and bite force on the y-axis. Edge bats are doing something completely different from everybody else. So the expected pattern, imagine if we hadn't split this up into groups, right? This would look like the expected pattern of a positive relationship of body, size to bite force. But when you split it into groups, edge bats are doing something completely different from open space bats and clutter bats. So initially when I saw that body mass result, I was like, yeah, maybe it's body mass. It's not really as strong of a predictor for bite force as other things, more length things. So I did forearm, similar pattern. I did skull length, which is much more definitive and tighter. And again, similar patterns. And if you can see, there's a lot of variation, at least the rate of change and the slope is much steeper than for the other groups. And this whole idea that forest edge bats are sort of on the smaller end of the spectrum, and they really should follow that pattern doesn't quite hold, right? The traditional pattern or expected pattern doesn't quite hold, right? But you can really see that there's a lot of variation on the bite force axis, and so there's something else going on with edge bats that are not that's not quite happening with the other foraging groups. Um, we can kind of leave bite force behind and start to think a little bit also about speciesary relationships, because this is really important for, the times that we live in. I mean, from the uh, last, or I want to say half/quarter of the last century, this whole idea of how do you conserve an area, and what sort of area do you need, and how do species change from across a different um, how the species how the species richness change with the area of the land that you're sampling. And this is what's the idealized relationship. If you log transform that, it's not a real straight line, but if you log transform at least area to species richness, this is sort of what you would expect to find is a positive relationship. And so if you're dealing, you're in this, you've gone to your field site, this whole frame of my computer right now is your field site, and you've trapped bats in open space, so bats in white here, and bats on the edge of that forest. So this is your idea of sort of paying attention to the bat foraging guilds. So bats on the edge and bats within the forest in blue here. uh, you can start to use whatever techniques because now you know to use them, right? Maybe not from this survey, but at least you know to use them in that in as part of your survey. And what you then find, you come back a few years later, or at least if you were comparing to other fragmented sites, say you have a whole site versus a non-fragmented site, what you're going to really find is that after fragmentation, what you're dealing with now is you've increased the edge, the number of the total area of the edge. And so now you have, again, more edges. Now you have more edge bats and more open space bats in your system than forest understory bats. And so if you report, oh, fragmentation is not a bad thing, which is what I've seen in a lot of studies, and there's been a good amount of pushback against this actually in the literature, and people do get quite upset actually, and I do too, but sometimes you keep it down. But this whole idea that, oh, fragmentation is not so bad, or habitat loss isn't so bad because you get more species. No, you're not getting species from outer space. They're not just originating out of nowhere. By fragmenting, you have added more edges to your forest patch, and so you're getting diversity that was previously not within this space. It was more outside, but now you've created more space, and so now you get more diversity, but it's kind of is diluted diversity, so to speak, at least as far as forests communities are concerned. So please, when you go out to do your surveys, and I'm really kind of making this comment because of a question, a study that was presented at a conference that I didn't ask the question about. This presenter concluded that because they were finding more bats um, habitat that they were surveying relative to the forest, they were suggesting that agriculture is not so bad for bats. And please, that is not an ecologically sound argument. It doesn't consider the fact that agriculture has broken this forest down, so to speak, fragmented the forest and increased, the number of edges and the number of spaces that other spaces outside of what would typically be a forest understory complement. Um, it's increased the space for them to then I don't want to use the word invade, but now find it conducive, so to speak. So please always ground your results in within the context of this sort of ecological thinking and understanding. And I think I'll leave that there. Let's see. So yes, so an example, a good example of this is a work published by Paul Webala out of Kenya, showing that, let's see if I can remember now. So this site that is in boxes, so the sites are in bold text. So that is a site with a very low, let's see, it's a very small forest fragment. There you go. And by forest fragment at this point, it's a severely degraded forest. But this corner as well is bats. Sorry, sites within a high like a larger fragment, and then somewhere in the middle. So what he was showing from this work, him and his colleagues, was that, the what you would consider to be forest understory bats were more abundant and tended towards the large fragment site, and then the medium fragment site. By fragment, I'm talking about area of the forest patch. Medium fragment sites had mostly edge species. So open space bats were primarily in this very low fragment site. And of course, I'm sure, um, again, this low fragment site, small fragment, um, were primarily uh, just, areas with use a lot of footpath. There's a lot of stumps. So there's been a lot of clearing and charcoal production. The arrows here indicating what kind of activity or environmental factor was most predominant in those places. And so you can see that the high fragment site had a huge canopy, but also tree density and stuff like that. So there are real consequences to not accounting for foraging guilds. And one of my favorite ones as well, and along those lines, that if you're studying forest understory bats, you start to see a huge difference. And this is a fairly complicated graph, and you should find that paper and read it yourself. Read it like a bajillion times. But what this paper is really showing is that if you don't look at forest bats relative to all species, you don't really see a good picture if you're working within forest areas. And that as fragment size increases, um, bat diversity for forest bats tend to increase. And they're both showing increase, but it's a much stronger relationship. And in fact, you do need up to about to 25,000 hectare area to start to really get a good diversity of bats above a control forest. So the colored horizontal lines are forest the control forest fragments, so to speak. But by the time you're dealing with all bats, you don't really need to go about, if you get up to about 100 hectare area, you're probably good. But with forest bats, you do need to get to, a good size area. So about, in this case, 2,500 hectares, which, is a huge departure from about 100 for all bats. So you really do need to consider forest understory bats to separate from other groups when you're talking about forest change, so to speak. But also, it's not just at the diversity level or community level, but when you start to look at individual species, you start to see that some species are extremely sensitive at the genetic level that, um, diversity is really low in small forest fragments relative to large forest fragments, especially for hypersensitive species. And so without looking at these sub-community level patterns and specifically focusing on you know, the different guilds or extracting, especially if you're working in forests, extracting the forest understory species and exploring how these patterns change. You're never going to fully understand what's happening to the system and how disturbance is affecting the system. And so these are really, really important steps to take when you're exploring things. If you're not able to do genetic diversity, at least you're able to explore how forest bats are responding relative to other groups. And it's really important for conservation, as I was saying earlier, and I'm just going to highlight some of this just from some of the work that I'm currently doing with conservation, primarily in Nigeria, but also Equatorial Guinea, the island, Bioko. Um, sorry, the bat that we're protecting occurs in Equatorial Guinea and Cameroon. And I can't tell you the contrast I'm trying to pull here is because I obviously have done my PhD in the US and have a bit more contact here in the US when I give talks, and not really scientific talks, but talks to the general public here in the US, especially around California and the American West. I can't tell you how many times people try to say, "Oh, you should probably use forest prescribed burns." What's called prescribed burns is more like a slow intensity forest that cleans the forest understory, and that it's been shown to be positively valuable for bats in the region, so in the American West. I can't tell you how many times people are like, "Oh, you study bats and you're trying to stop fires. Okay, well, why don't you use prescribed burns for fires for your forests in Africa, and that it would be good for bats." I can't tell you how many times I mean, I would be really rich if I were, making, say, $10 every time I respond to that kind of question. It's almost every single time. In fact, now I face my talks by saying I'm in California. I know our forest fires do not behave like your forest fires, but it really is coming from the idea that there's a huge difference between the forest understory bats in, say, the Paleotropics, or even particularly in this case, the Palearctic, so in California, versus the forest bats in our neck of the woods in Nigeria and the Paleotropics, because the bats here in the US, the forest bats here, are not as adapted for they don't have this, not high intensity, high frequency echolocation that impacts your ability to find prey in the forest understory. And so they're not true forest understory bats. And so even though they're using the forest understory, it has to be fairly open for them to really find your way around or forage in those spaces. Whereas our bats really do need that, nice clutter with lots of species that are just with lots of resting spaces for insects that are just like right in front of you so that your echolocation can pick it up. You do need to really think about that connection there to be able to make that argument. And so I just tell people our bats are not like your bats, and it's always fun to point that out. But it's a real concern, and in our case, because wildfires are a problem for the bat that we're trying to protect, it's become a serious effort to make sure that forest understories in equatorial forests are not reduced by fires or thinned by fires in any way, whether prescribed burns or wildfires. And so that's why we're really trying to make sure that forest understory bats get the protection they need, but specifically this tiny bat that we're trying to protect, the short-tailed roundleaf bat. And that's what sort of built this whole conservation work that we've been doing. And I can tell you that that tiny bat, the short-tailed roundleaf bat, Hippoceras curtus, does not like burnt areas because at least we were able to recover just one individual from a burnt site with a 10-year fire history. 10 years. That site was burned 10 years ago. And we were only able to catch just one individual, and in fact, it was on the major trail. So I really suspect that individual was just flying to go get water. There was water down south from where, at least slightly low elevation from where we caught that individual. So we believe it was flying along the main trail because that's an important way to move between patches within the forest, right? Or areas or sections within the forest. But in unburnt areas, we've been trapping lots of bats. Although I would preface this result by saying, hey, after we trapped at this one burnt location, we didn't go back there. So, um, and my work really did avoid a lot of burnt sites. Because I was trying to, for my PhD, I was really trying to find all the bats I could get in in high high canopy covered forests. All right, so just a quick shout out to the work that our team does on the ground. It's a lot of intensive work managing communities, but it's sort of this whole connection again to paying attention to what's happening to the different foraging guilds. In our case, our tiny bat, we know because it's a forest understory bat, it's forest adapted, and it doesn't like burnt areas. We must stop those fires, and that's where we've connected this whole dots from you're conceptualizing your project to the conservation of a species should it need to be conserved. And I would like to stop there. I've got about 5 minutes for questions. Thank you. Hmm.
Thank you so much. That was an excellent talk, and it's something that I definitely am personally interested too, because I also study like ecological niches of bats, and I couldn't agree more of pretty much everything that you said, that you have to think about the different contexts of where you are and what you're looking for and how these different groups are going to be behaving based on all of that. So thank you so much for putting that in framing it in such a fantastic talk. So um incredible talk. Thank you so much, Aurora.
Thanks, Ellen.
Uh if does anyone in the chat who's still here have any questions, or if not, I do. So and you can feel free to unmute yourself, or you can put it in the chat. And otherwise, I'll start it off. So you kind of you started to talk about fire. I was thinking about fire earlier in the talk before you brought it up, because I know that fire and the attitude around fire is different for so many different regions. And I was also thinking about the creation of this edge space. So I was wondering, do you see a difference in the community assemblages in something versus the creation of a road versus something like edge space that's created by fire?
That's a good question. They will have different impacts for sure. Roads, depending on what kind of road it is, if it's just, I've seen roads that are, regular size, 10, plus meters, but they're not paved and the traffic's quite low. And what we do know is whether the road is paved versus unpaved, and so how much traffic you get, it does impact bat diversity. In fact, my first master's looked at this in the UK, primarily, how high density, high traffic roads can drive bat diversity one way or another on both sides. And so I sort of coming from that angle, I would say that the edge is much more different if you're walking along a road versus an edge created by wildfires. And wildfires specifically don't just create an edge, they swallow up the forest almost. So they take up a lot of the wood, they take up a lot of the forest litter that would hold a lot of diversity as well. So there's a whole thing with there are two different impacts, but they do create different types of edges in addition to other impacts that would affect bat populations.
All right. Okay, so we've got let's see. Yes, a question in the chat. So first, hi Aurora, thanks so much. Those are incredible contributions. How do you think fragmentation can affect bat diversity at the roost level when not all bat roosts are located at the edge of the forest fragment? You think that could affect the bats?
That's a good question. So, roosts are a whole other thing. Roost availability is a big factor in exploring the impact of fragmentation because sometimes your roosts, if your cave-dependent bats could be very well outside of the forest altogether, but of course, Bats will find linear structures to travel along, at least to get to their foraging sites at night. And so the creation of fragmentation, of forest edges by fragmentation, um, shouldn't really directly impact cave-dependent bats. But if it's a forest roosting species, so it roosts on the tree on tree barks, or just hanging from tree leaves or trees, so to speak. Um, Adding more fragmentation will certainly introduce more room for edge bats that are that are tree roosting. So there's a whole dynamic there that you have to always sort of consider. It's if you're managing a space for a bat that's an edge bat, you're probably okay adding additional edges. But as we know, um, for hyper diverse areas, breaking down the edges just doesn't help, the community. It might target one bat species. So what you really want to do in that case would be to take into account the fact that your intervention should certainly I know I've sort of jumped all the way to intervention here, or you're talking about impacts. Well, your intervention should certainly be something that is positive for as many species and perhaps the entire community as much as possible, even though you're focused on the tiny bat you're trying to protect.
All right, well, that brings us to the top of the hour. And so looks like we actually have a handful of people who got had a time zone mix up too.
Oh,
So,
that's a
uh,
shame.
uh, uh, regardless, thank you so much, Aurora. I think that was an absolutely brilliant talk. It really showed great ways of applying what we need to know about how to approach these types of studies for our own work. So thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today. And yeah, and otherwise, for thank you so much for everyone for joining us this morning, this afternoon, or this evening. And stay tuned for our next announcement for our speaker in August. Otherwise, have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone, and see you next time.
Thanks, Dana.
Thank you
Bye.
so much.